Have you ever been quietly removed by your own family? I have, on the morning of my 25th birthday. No happy birthday, no eye contact, just one sentence. Graham needs the space. And my suitcase, already waiting by the door. They didn't kick me out. They orchestrated my exit, like a corporate downsizing. Except I wasn't an employee. I was their daughter. 1 week later, they called. Not to check in, not to ask if I was okay. They wanted the shares, the ones my grandfather left behind, for me and only me. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own home, drop a 1 in the comments. If you haven't, consider yourself lucky and drop a 0. Because sometimes silence isn't peace. It's exile wrapped in linen napkins and polite voices. Don't scroll away. This might be the first time someone tells your story out loud. And walking away might be the first honest thing you ever do. I turned 25 the Thursday before Thanksgiving. My mother laid out breakfast like any other morning. Toast, orange juice, a folded napkin. Except that morning, I wasn't staying. The steam rose off the toast in slow curls, catching the pale light that slipped in through the frosted kitchen windows. I watched it from the hallway, unnoticed. The lemon scent of disinfectant clung to every surface, like the house had been scrubbed clean of emotion the night before. The radio hummed quietly from the counter. WXPN. Low volume. Jazz bleeding into the morning forecast. I hadn't heard anyone come down the stairs, but somehow the kitchen was already occupied by people not looking at each other. I remember thinking how clean the kitchen looked. Too clean, like someone had come in during the night and erased the trace of me. The chairs were neatly pushed in, even mine. A streak on the countertop caught the light. A missed swipe of lemon cleaner. It felt like being evicted from a museum exhibit about a family I used to belong to. I heard the clock in the living room click to 7:04 a.m., and like clockwork, my father appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled above his wrists, his tie perfectly centered. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped in, my slippers silent on the tile. The table was already set. 2 mugs, one for him, one for my mother. No third. My plate, though, sat in front of the empty chair. Toast, orange juice, a folded napkin. My suitcase waited near the door, brown leather and zipped, like it had been part of the decor all along. I sat slowly. My mother didn't raise her eyes from her coffee. She sipped it like it mattered more than anything she might have to say. No one wished me happy birthday. "I assume you know why," my father said, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Graham's coming back next week." I didn't answer. "He'll be staying in the guest house." I thought the guest house was mine. "It was temporary," he replied, as if explaining a bank policy. "You've had a good run, but it's time." I looked to my mother. Nothing. Just the faint clink of her spoon against ceramic. "We think," she said finally softly, "it's best. For everyone." I looked back at my father. "You already packed my things." He didn't flinch. "Only the essentials." Years ago, I overheard him on the phone telling someone, "Claire's always stable." Like I was a savings bond, safe, contained, predictable. Something you store away and expect not to move. Where exactly am I supposed to go? "We assumed you had plans." "I don't." "Well," he said, standing, brushing non-existent lint from his cuffs, "you'll figure something out." The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was curated, intentional, like a pause in a script, rehearsed enough that no one had to fake discomfort. I stood. My toast was already cold. The toast tasted like cardboard. I chewed once, then let it sit in my mouth until it went soggy. My mother pretended not to notice. She focused on her crossword puzzle, pencil in hand, like it was any other morning. That ritual of hers, silent and precise, had always given me comfort as a child. Now it felt like a wall. The house creaked above us. Old pipes, maybe. Or maybe Graham's ghost. He hadn't lived there in years, but somehow his return felt inevitable, like he never truly left. Growing up, I was always the quiet one, the afterthought. Graham was the headline. The worst part wasn't being asked to leave. It was the sense that they'd rehearsed it, that they'd waited until the exact minute when it would hurt the least, or maybe the most. No raised voices, no drama, just a corporate-style offboarding. I turned once before opening the door, just in case someone, anyone, looked up. My mother tapped her pencil. My father had already opened his laptop. The space I had occupied for 25 years collapsed behind me like it had never existed. I picked up my suitcase. The leather handle was warm from sitting in the sun near the window. It felt heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just realizing how much I'd already lost. My boots crunched softly on the gravel path. I kept my eyes on the sidewalk cracks, too afraid that if I looked back, I'd shatter. The cold made my skin tighten, my breath foggy and fast. Halfway down the path, I heard the kitchen door close behind me. That final sound, soft but firm. It echoed in my bones. The radio was still muttering the weather, 36 degrees, with a chance of snow by nightfall. You always imagine you'll fight, that you'll scream or slam something. But I just walked, quietly, like leaving was the only thing left I was allowed to do. I didn't cry. I didn't even stop walking. Just one foot, then the other, like I already knew there'd be no looking back. The motel smelled like bleach and longing. I almost missed it. The envelope tucked deep in the suitcase lining, with my name written in my grandfather's hand. Room 207 was as unremarkable as every roadside motel room I'd ever imagined. The walls were a yellow that had probably once been white. The linoleum cracked in one corner, beneath a flimsy nightstand. A vending machine hummed on the other side of the wall, its rhythm vibrating into the floor like a second heartbeat. Outside, the sky sagged with the weight of late November in Pennsylvania. Gray, damp, low. I placed my suitcase on the bed. Not because I wanted to unpack, but because standing still too long made me feel like I'd disappear. The bedspread was stiff with starch, printed in a dizzy pattern of browns and reds that didn't try to be welcoming. I unpacked slowly. Socks, a phone charger, toothbrush. Every item folded and arranged like a ritual, like I could make this room mine by sheer precision. There was no one to welcome me here. But I tried anyway, in my quiet, habitual way. And then I saw it. A corner of something cream-colored, tucked deep in the lining of the suitcase. It had fallen behind the zipper seam. I reached for it, hesitant, as if it might vanish the moment I touched it. It was an envelope. My name is written on the front in thin, precise letters. Engineer script. Walter Hartman's hand. My breath caught in my throat. 10 years ago, at his funeral, I had stood near the back, behind the potluck casseroles and lukewarm eulogies. I was 15, not important enough to be asked to speak, too important to pretend I didn't care. And at the very end, someone, an old friend of his from the plant maybe, had pulled me aside and whispered, "Walter said something for you. Not until you're 25. That was all. I had shrugged it off. Someday had seemed like another lifetime, but here it was. Someday had arrived, a week late and one eviction too soon. I sat on the edge of the bed. The vending machine whirred. My fingers ran along the seal, careful not to tear. Inside were two things, a letter, and a thick notarized document. The letter was a single sheet, typed, "No, dear Claire," no sign-off, just lines of clean, quiet thought, like the blueprints he used to draft, with all the emotion hidden in the angles. "You see more than you speak," he wrote, "and you wait longer than you should. These are not flaws." I paused. My throat tightened, not from tears, but from the strange comfort of being known. I built Hartman timber with calloused hands and clear math, but I always watched how you notice things others didn't. Precision isn't about being correct. It's about being faithful to what's in front of you. That's why this is yours now. I unfolded the legal document. My name was there. Claire Margaret Hartman, owner of 15% of Hartman Timber Co., effective as of my 25th birthday. I stared. He had written about clarity, about legacy. Not in sentimental terms, but in outlines and lines of logic. I imagined him in his work shed, pencil behind one ear, drafting this future in silence. I remembered the way he used to hand me little wooden boxes he'd made, smooth, dovetailed corners, no nails. Quiet craftsmanship, he'd call it. At the bottom of the letter was a name, Susan Kellerman, estate lawyer. And below that, in bold, "If they never told you, call her." I stared at that sentence for a long time. My stomach turned, because they hadn't. My parents had never said a word. Have you ever discovered that the people who raised you also tried to erase you? The kind of silence that's not innocent, but chosen. If you've ever been kept in the dark by those who should have protected you, leave a comment number 8 below. Now let's see what happened next. I wondered how long they'd known. Had they opened the envelope, peeked at the contents, sealed it back up like it never existed? Or had they always planned to bury it under the weight of their expectations for Graham? I looked at the number scribbled below the lawyer's name. The digits blurred slightly in my vision. My hands were cold, my chest hollow. I sat in that motel room where the air smelled of bleach and years I couldn't get back. And I waited. For certainty, for anger, for anything. Then I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I stared at the number for a long time before dialing. But I did. Susan Kellerman's office was between a notary and a sandwich shop. It didn't look like a place where things changed, but for me, it was. It had been drizzling since morning, the kind of thin, persistent rain that made everything feel smaller, closer. I stepped through the front door of the second-story office building just as a delivery boy passed me on the stairs, balancing a bag that smelled like pastrami and onions. Inside, the receptionist sat behind a desk with a nameplate that read Darla. She had auburn hair and a posture that said she'd seen too many people walk in and out of this place without looking up. But when I said my name, Claire Hartman, she paused. "Claire Hartman?" she repeated slowly, as if testing the name against some internal record. I nodded. "One moment." She stood and disappeared down a hallway, heels muted against the carpet. The waiting area smelled like old paper and lemon-scented cleaner. The carpet was a deep forest green, and the walls were lined with framed photographs, none of them family portraits, just landscapes and architectural sketches. There was a small fern on the windowsill, trying its best to stay alive. When Susan Kellerman appeared, I wasn't sure what to expect. But she was. Precise. Her steel gray suit matched the efficiency in her posture. Her silver hair was twisted into a low bun. She looked like she had no time for sentiment, and oddly, that calmed me. "Claire," she said, extending a firm hand, "I've been expecting you." I followed her down the hallway, into an office that smelled like paper, cedar, and quiet professionalism. Behind her desk hung a framed photo of her with a golden retriever, mid-laugh, the kind of moment someone else had captured when she wasn't trying. It made me like her instantly. She gestured for me to sit. "You brought the envelope?" I handed it over, still sealed. Susan opened it carefully, unfolded the papers, and began to read. She didn't rush. She didn't ask me why I was only just opening it now, or where I'd been. Just read, with the practiced calm of someone who had seen 100 versions of this moment before. When she spoke, her voice was even, professional, but not cold. "Your name's been on file for a decade," she said. "Your grandfather was meticulous." She slid a set of printed documents toward me. 15% ownership in Hartman Timber Company. Voting shares. Dividend rights. Legal voice. It's all here. 15%. I stared at the number, then at the signature beneath it. Walter J. Hartman. His penmanship had always looked like drafting. Clean lines, minimal curves, measured strokes. I traced his name with my finger, not quite believing it was real. "He believed in precision," I said aloud, more to myself than to Susan. She nodded. "He also believed in clarity. He didn't leave room for questions." She opened a leather folder and slipped the documents inside, then handed it to me. "If anyone questions this," she said, locking eyes with me, "give them my number." "It's in there." The receptionist, Darla, looked up as I left. She didn't say anything, but her eyes followed the folder in my arms like it had changed me. Maybe it had. Outside, the clouds were still low, the sidewalk still wet. I paused near the building steps and just stood there for a second, breathing. It hit me then. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had tried to delete me, to redact me from the narrative. But my grandfather wouldn't let them. I gripped the folder tighter and began walking, not back toward the motel, but toward something else. I didn't know where yet, but I knew what I was searching for. I didn't go back to the motel. I searched for studio space, something with light and a door that locked from the inside. At 9:07 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. But I answered anyway. Some reflexes are harder to unlearn than trust. The light in the studio apartment flickered gently, casting long shadows against the chipped white wall. Outside, fog clung to the window panes like breath. I had just finished reheating a bowl of canned soup, its steam curling upward with more intention than I felt. The couch, secondhand and slumped in the middle, sank under my weight as I picked up the call. "Claire?" The voice was thinner than I remembered. "Graham." There was a pause, just long enough for me to wonder if he was weighing whether to hang up or ask me for something. "I know it's late," he said, his words wobbling like a leg on an uneven chair. I didn't know who else to call. I leaned back, pressing the phone closer to my ear, not to miss anything, but more like bracing. What happened? He didn't tell the story in order. Bits and pieces spilled like scattered receipts from a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The startup, his big gamble, had fallen apart. Investors were pulling out. One had filed suit. The accounts were frozen. Payroll bounced. "I thought we had a runway," he mumbled, but it was built over a sinkhole. I didn't interrupt, not even when he said, "Dad's name was on the collateral for one of the bridge loans." Of course it was. "We tied it to the family business," he continued. "It made sense at the time, stability and all that." That word again. There was a silence, not a pause, just a full surrender of sound, the kind that settles into the room like fog into a valley. "Mom said you might know someone," Graham added eventually. His voice didn't crack from grief. It cracked from something more complicated. Entitlement buckling under the weight of panic. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I wasn't shaking. "What is it you think I can do?" I asked. "I don't know, just help." He didn't say sorry. The call ended without any promises. I set the phone down on the windowsill and stood there, arms folded, staring at the glowing rectangle of the street lamp outside. The soup on the table had gone cold. I didn't mind. That night, I got a message from Aunt Lillian. Short, punctuated, like she was trying not to say too much. "I heard about Graham. If you need anything, call me." Her number was still the same. I hadn't used it in 6 years. I stayed on the couch long after the call ended, the phone still warm in my palm. I kept staring at the ceiling, following the flicker of headlights that cut across the plaster through the front window blinds. The studio was too quiet again, and that kind of quiet didn't come with peace. It came with memory, the kind that presses against the back of your throat until your breath shortens. I thought about Graham's voice, not the panic in it, but what was underneath. Shame doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it sounds like an old friend who forgot your name and is too embarrassed to ask again. I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and sat by the window. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A couple argued next door. All of it felt a million miles away from the phone that had buzzed like it still had something to say. But it didn't. It never did. Only I did. Or maybe I used to. I opened the folder Susan gave me, ran my fingers over the embossed letterhead, and whispered to no one, "I didn't disappear. You just stopped looking." Then, as if the universe had been holding its breath, the house line, our house back in Doylestown, lit up on my screen. That number hadn't appeared in years. The next night, the house line called. That number hadn't appeared on my screen in years. "Claire!" My mother's voice began, thin and brittle. "This affects all of us." That's how she always framed it. Us. Like I was just the edge of the picture. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I'd been. Just opened the call like a memo. My fingers had hesitated before answering. The house number again. Twice in 2 nights, after years of silence. The kind of silence that had shape and density. A silence that could suffocate. I sat on the edge of my bed, feet bare on the hardwood. The tea I'd finally made last night sat cold and half-finished beside me. I didn't interrupt her, just listened. "We know what your grandfather left you," she said. A pause. "It's caused discussion. The board is nervous. The banks. Well, we need someone they'll trust." Outside, traffic murmured against the fog. Inside, my coat hung loose around my shoulders, more robe than armor. I didn't know what I had expected to feel, but it wasn't this. Calm, bone deep, like a river finding its stone bed. "Why not Graham?" I asked. There was a rustle, paper maybe, our pride being folded and put away. No answer. Then a shift in tone. My father came on. "Claire," he said, just that. My name, no softening, no small talk. He cleared his throat. "We made mistakes, but this isn't the time for resentment. The company needs to present unity. Your shares complicate things." I stared at the wall across from me. A painting I hadn't hung yet leaned against it, wrapped in brown paper. My work, unclaimed, just like me. "You told me I wasn't family," I said, voice steady. "And I believed you. Have you ever been pushed aside, only to be needed later, when it's convenient? That quiet ache when you realize you were never part of us, just part of the solution. If you understand that kind of hurt, leave a comment number 9 below. Now, let's see how it ends. I didn't wait for what came next. I ended the call. Let the silence return on my terms. The room didn't echo. It absorbed. The couch creaked as I leaned forward, elbows on knees, phone loose in my hand. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory. I remembered sitting on the porch one Thanksgiving while everyone toasted Graham's spelling bee win. I was 12. The air had been sharp with cold. My coat unzipped because I'd run outside too quickly. No one followed. No one noticed. From where I sat, I could see the dining room through the window, the flicker of candlelight, silverware clinking. My name didn't come up once. Later that night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Thanksgiving, years ago. Graham grinning, missing a tooth. A pie on the counter, my mother's handwriting labeling it, "For the Hartmans." And me, just the edge of the frame, visible only by my elbow, outside on the porch, wind in my hair. I hadn't forgotten. I just stopped waiting for anyone else to remember. A message pinged. Aunt Lillian, simple as ever. Say it how you remember it. I got up and walked to the kitchenette, opened the cupboard, closed it. I wasn't hungry. The call had settled in my chest like a stone, not heavy enough to crush, just enough to weigh. What would happen now? They'd scramble, surely. Graham would flounder, investors would demand a face, and they'd search for one with less baggage. They didn't want me, not really. They wanted the part of me that Walter had believed in, the part with credibility and the signature on the document. But I wasn't here to rescue anyone. This studio, this space, I had bought it with nothing but nerve and a sketchbook. No one clapped when I signed the lease. No one toasted when I sold my first piece. No one asked if I was eating, sleeping, surviving. And yet, I had survived. That night, I didn't paint. I sat at my work table, flicking the edge of an old receipt back and forth under my finger, thinking about all the ways silence had shaped me. It had become my instinct, my first language. When people spoke of power, they meant volume. But Walter had known, real power lived in precision, in patience. I thought about what Aunt Lillian meant. Say it how you remember it. Not scream, not argue. Just hold it steady in my palms and offer it without trembling. They'd tell their version. I had mine. And mine didn't need applause. I opened my sketchbook and began to draw. Not a person, not a thing, just lines. Quiet ones, stacked like fences. Then shadows across them. Then the open space between. When I stopped, it was past midnight. The studio was still, but it no longer felt hollow. I turned off the lights, left only the porch bulb burning, and then, quietly, I stepped outside with my phone. The light over the door buzzed. I lifted the camera and took a photo of the small plaque I'd screwed into the frame a week earlier. It read, Claire Evelyn Studio. In quiet, I built. No caption, no explanation. I sent it to my father's number. No message, just truth. I didn't wait for a reply. Some doors don't need to slam shut. They just stop opening. It had been 2 weeks since I sent the photo to my father. Nothing had followed. Not a call, not a text. And strangely, not even a rumor through the quiet channels that once fed me scraps of family updates. The silence stretched, not sharp this time, not heavy, but clean, like a room finally cleared of dust. My studio smelled of cinnamon and wood shavings. I'd rearranged the prints twice already that morning, not out of nervousness, just a quiet urge to refresh. The cold light from the window cut long shadows across the floor. December had come like a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. I boiled water for tea, the kettle letting out its gentle hiss. On the shelf above, the leather folder still sat. I didn't need to open it. I just liked knowing it was there. The sketch pad beside it was open to a half-finished piece, spare lines and soft shapes that didn't ask to be understood. Later that day, I walked the few blocks to the gallery. It was a modest space tucked between a framing store and a florist, both of which were closed for the evening. Inside, yellow light warmed the white walls, casting soft shadows behind each piece on display. My prints hung in a narrow alcove, 6 in total, framed but simple. A woman in a navy wool coat studied them quietly. A young couple murmured over one in the corner, the girl tilting her head, the boy squinting like he could read something hidden in the lines. I stood by the small table set up with tea and postcards. No one noticed me, and that was fine. Aunt Lillian arrived just after 7. She didn't say much, just took off her gloves and touched my elbow. She stood beside me, watching the visitors move. We didn't need to speak. Her presence filled a space I hadn't known I'd left vacant. Someone pointed to the photo on the wall. It showed the plaque outside my studio door. "What does it mean?" they asked. I smiled. "It's a reminder," I said, "that quiet doesn't mean absent, and that some things grow better without noise." When the night ended, Lillian offered me a ride. I declined. I wanted the walk. The street was lit by lamps and strung holiday lights, flickering above the sidewalks. A light snow had begun to fall, brushing against my coat and catching in my hair. The night was full of cold and stillness and peace. Back in the studio, I turned off most of the lights, leaving only the one above my desk. I made tea, cinnamon and chamomile, and curled up on the couch with the blanket Aunt Lillian had brought me the month before. The letter from Walter was still in its folder. I read it again. The paper had begun to soften at the edges, but his handwriting remained sharp. "Silence can be structural, if you build with it right." That line had stayed with me, not like a quote to be framed, but like scaffolding, supporting the choices I now made. I looked around the space. There were bills to pay, orders to fill, but this was mine. All of it, not inherited, not granted. Built, quietly, daily, stubbornly. The next morning, I opened the windows despite the cold. The air rushed in, crisp and honest. I moved the studio tables closer to the light, like tilting towards something I had stopped fearing. I sketched a little, erased a lot, and then let my hand rest. Not every day needed to be productive. Some just needed to be lived. A message came in from a client in Oregon, another commission for a holiday gift. I responded with a brief yes, noting the timeline. My handwriting was steady. My voice in email, too, had changed. Firmer, more spare. I walked to the corner cafe, the same one where I used to pretend to work just to feel less alone. Now I sat by the window, not to be seen, but to see. People passed, bundled, tired, laughing, rushing, all of them carrying something unseen. And I wondered how many had chosen silence, not because they had to, but because it made room for something truer. That night, I lit a candle in the studio, not for warmth, but as a marker. I pulled a small canvas from the shelf. I wasn't sure yet what it would become, but I liked the feel of it under my hand. That was enough, and the silence stayed. But not the kind that bruises. Some silences are endings, others are beginnings. Some mornings, I still reach for the silence, like it's something I earned. Not as absence, but as a shelter I built brick by brick. Out of truth, out of choosing myself when they wouldn't. I've come to believe that not all families are meant to be mended. Some are meant to be understood, gently, from a distance. What I carry forward isn't bitterness, but a steadiness, a knowing, that even if I was once the edge of their picture, I've become the whole frame of mine. And perhaps that's what legacy truly is. Not what we're given, but what we dare to keep and make our own. Thank you for listening to my story. Goodbye, and until next time.